I'm really excited to welcome everyone to our very first Bloomsbury Handbook Speaker Series session with Dr. Mary Drinkwater and Dr. Julia Christensen Hughes. I know Mary and Julia have a great session planned for us today, so I'm just going to jump right into things. If at any point you have any issues with the Zoom, seeing the slides, audio issues, please don't hesitate to message me and I'll try my best to help you get that sorted out. So if you don't already know me, my name is Jenny and I'm the Senior Educational Developer, Scholarship of Teaching and Learning at our Center for Excellence in Teaching and Innovation. And I would like to open today with a land acknowledgement by first sharing this resource in the chat. So please take a look. Once you're in, you should see on the left-hand side a search bar where you can actually type in your location and find information about the territory you are on. And you can be specific. You can have like a city, or you can even pick the province or kind of go broader. It is a growing resource and anyone can send in information or recommend changes. So you can take a look. And the reason I wanted to share this is because, as we know, YU TFS is a proud coast-to-coast institution. We have physical and online campuses that are built on and draw resources for multiple treaty lands in what we now call Canada. And many of us work both on the physical campuses and in our own homes, which may be on different treaty lands. I know some of us are also outside of Canada. So as I take the next moment to acknowledge the land in New Brunswick, Ontario, and British Columbia on which our campuses sit, I encourage everyone to also take a moment to use that link and learn a little bit more about wherever you may be currently situated. So our campus in what is now known as New Brunswick sits on land under the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1760 and 1761, and on the land of the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Mi'kmaq, and the Wolastoqey Maliseet First Nation. Our campuses in what is now known as downtown Toronto, as well as the Steeles neighborhood in Toronto, sit on treaty land of the Toronto Purchase of 1787, also known as Treaty 13, which is the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And our campus in what is now known as British Columbia is not treaty land, but sits on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, and Kakite First Nations. You can learn more about these treaties and histories and stories through the Native Land link. It is my incredible honor to welcome Mary and Julia and everyone to the session. I think we all know who Mary and Julia are, so I'll just say quickly for our Friday afternoon brains, which may be slowing down, that Mary is the amazing leader behind the 4 Bloomsbury Handbooks of Crises and Transformative Leadership in Higher Education. And Julia, our wonderful president and vice chancellor, is one of several Yorkville University contributors to the handbooks. So they will be talking to us today about how the handbooks came to be and implications for our roles and work at YU TFS. As we hear more from them shortly on some of the ways in which we in higher education are well positioned to work together to address and overcome ongoing global crises, let us all also continue to reflect on and identify opportunities in which we can move towards truth and reconciliation in all of this work. So thank you for listening to that. And thank you to Tommy for graciously sharing with me his coast-to-coast land acknowledgement so that I could adapt it for today. And I'll turn it over to Mary and Julia.
Thank you, Jenny.
I'll just do a very quick run through the agenda, and then I'll turn it over to Julia. So the welcome and the acknowledgement, you've already had a little bit of that. I'm going to do just a little piece of acknowledgement related to the book in a moment. This is set up to be a dialogue between Julia and I, back and forth, and then hopefully bringing all of you into the dialogue as we move forward. As Julia said and Jenny said, please add things into the chat as things come up. I know a couple of questions will be thrown out to you to reflect on as we go through. I'll give, when it's my opportunity, I'll give a bit of background and impetus to why the handbook series was created. The basis of the whole thing is that it was created at times of the pandemic and COVID, but change in our institutions is the only thing that is constant. It is going to continue to happen. I'll do a little bit on what the theoretical framework of the whole book series is and why I chose that, or why we chose that. Little bit on the 4 themes that came out and how these books ended up being organized under these themes. And then I'll do a little bit on the key lessons that came out across each of the books. And then we're going to put this into practice. If you ever write theory or do research, it needs to be connected to the real world. And Yorkville is doing some incredible stuff already related to many of the themes within the book. And then throughout the whole dialogue, we're asking you to do this blue sky thinking and keep thinking about the hopes and the possibilities at Yorkville. And this is where your voices are really important. They've been brought in all along, but Julia will speak more to that when she gets to her section. Let me turn it over to Julia.
Well, thank you, Mary, and thank you, Jenny. I just want to go back to Jenny's introduction. I didn't realize we had that resource. Thank you so much for sharing that link in the chat. That's absolutely brilliant. And I love when we're modeling that we all need to engage with ongoing learning and contributing to reconciliation. So that was a real gift, Jenny. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you, Mary. What a delight to have the opportunity to facilitate this session with you today. Mary and I have known each other for many, many years. We've actually holidayed together, actually at a location very close to Allison's cottage. But when I first joined Yorkville, I was so thrilled to realize that Mary already worked for Yorkville. And I know she also worked for OISE and for Queen's. So Mary is absolutely prolific in her impact and her passion for facilitating transformative change in higher education. And I thought before Mary jumped into the book, and I'm going to ask her about really what, sort of propelled this incredible project. But just, I was going to ask Mary just to share a little bit more about herself and thinking back, Mary, to your own life journey and sort of those early experiences that you believe may have propelled your interest and your commitment to helping drive transformative change in higher education. Do you mind telling us a little bit of that story?
Not at all. And just even the connection, as Julia said, because our lives go back, as we all talk about the formative years and how important those formative years are in anyone's lives. For me, born in the 50s, growing up in the 60s, that was a period of immense change, not just in education, but in everything around the world. Going to university, starting my university in the late 70s, and faculties of education at that time really pushed what we're calling now transformative leadership or transformative education, because it was strongly about issues of social justice and equity and diversity. But those terms have now come back in 40, 50 years later. That's where my beginnings, and that's where, when you talk about your own educational philosophy and foundations, it's often grounded on your formative years and your formative experiences. And not just my growing up experiences, but my educational experiences. So when I was able to start teaching, and I did my first career as a secondary teacher and then secondary administrator, in the early years, in the late 70s, early 80s, we were able to do a lot of this work of creation of curriculum that spoke to the needs of the schools, of the students, of the communities in which we were teaching. And it's so good to see this coming back, not just on a local through a local lens, but also through a global lens. And you'll hear about this with the book series. It comes back really important. I had a chance after I fortunately started early and had my children early and had a chance to retire, do the early retirement at about 50, I think. Had a fully funded offer at OISE and at Queen's to do the PhD, but I chose OISE for many reasons. Did my PhD there. I continued to teach at OISE. I also teach at Yorkville. I was invited to come in here in about 2018, I think, by Ellen Lyle in the Faculty of Education. I also have taught over the years at Queen's in their graduate program, but I was elected onto the governing council at Queen's, and it's a conflict of I feel it's a conflict of interest to be teaching and being in a governance position. So I teach now only at Boise and Yorkville and try to bring this foundational piece of mine into my own work. Julia, do you want me to stretch it into how, or do you want to ask about how this got into the book?
Let me jump in and just say thank you for sharing that background, Mary. I think it's really important to help sort of situate this particular project, because I think really this was a passion project, right? And it really is the culmination of your journey in a sense, right? All these questions you've been asking yourself about what is the purpose of higher education? What kind of leadership is needed to drive the kinds of changes that need to happen in order to better serve our students and better serve society? So do you remember the moment when you said, oh my goodness, I have to do this. I have to create this book?
I remember it exactly because, as most of us, we were sitting in the pandemic, and I have 5 adult children at the time, and I'm sort of looking at what's happening around me, teaching virtually, and looking at what universities were doing, particularly right after, as it started, and right after it started, trying to figure out how do we make sense of this, and just jumping into surviving crisis and crisis leadership. And that's and because my field, I didn't talk about my field is in leadership and policy in education, but it's also in comparative international education. So as I looked at my colleagues and I looked at other universities around the world in terms of how they were all leading and managing through the beginning and through the first 2 years of the pandemic, I sort of just started thinking, as most of you did through the pandemic, about what type of leadership and why that leadership was coming into place. And I also watched over the first 2 years lots of different ways of moving forward. So it was really interesting. I reached out first to my colleague, Patrick Dean, who's the principal and vice chancellor at Queen's University, because I knew what Patrick had been doing in his first year before the pandemic started. He came in the year just before the pandemic started. But of starting a change process. And I reached out and said, would you be interested in taking on something like this with me? And I had a publisher already at Bloomsbury, because I had just finished another big book on democracy and peace and citizenship, again, globally. And Bloomsbury was interested, and they saw a real need. And when we sent out the call, people all over the world responded saying, we need this. We really need this, not just during the pandemic, but we need it to be broader around crisis and change, because that is going to happen. And how crisis and change is defined can be quite different in all these different locations. And I can talk a bit more about that later on. But as I said, change is the only constant.
Well, it's interesting, Mary, because of course I joined Yorkville 3 years ago, right in the middle of the pandemic. And what was absolutely intriguing to me is that I was hired to become president of Yorkville without actually ever having met anyone in person. I didn't know that would be possible. And my first day as president, I essentially walked to the den in my basement and turned on my computer. I don't know any other president of a university who started their role in that way, but of course we were all having to learn new things and adapt, right? And the unexpected, but also the sense of sort of a desperation within society, right? As so many people were so uncomfortable with the unknown. And I remember when the phrase, we're all in this together, right? Kept coming out, but then people realized, yeah, no, we're not all in this together, as as people were impacted quite differently, right? Depending on their privilege within society. And certainly I was highly privileged to be very safe in my basement den with my laptop, but nevertheless having to learn all kinds of new things about online engagement. Anyway, so really interesting to remind us of the time and the context and sort of what fueled your idea. And I keep saying for this book, because originally it was
going to
book,
be one book.
right? And so how the heck did it turn into a 4-volume book series? And I'm someone who's edited books myself. I can only imagine then the additional workload that you took on. But I also want to share that I was so delighted that Yorkville could support the project. So for people who aren't aware, Mary applied for one of the jobs or one of the grants, and I think it's John Crosley at the time, I think, was overseeing
yes.
committee. Anyway, I was so pleased, Mary, when you came to me and told me that you'd made application, that John had supported. As a result of that, you could hire a grad student from YU to help with some of the administrative tasks associated with the project. But maybe just say a little bit about how did it go from 1 book to 4?
Well, again, it was the call that went out. Oh, at the time too, Patrick Dean, but then we had another colleague who was one of the leaders in the Magna Carta Observatory in Bologna, who they're doing a huge global project around values. He passed away suddenly. So I had to reach out to another colleague, wondering if he would jump in. But Yusuf Wagiad, who is a professor emeritus down in Stellenbosch University in South Africa, who is an outstanding global scholar. He was the co-editor of the book that Julia's chapter is in. Just an outstanding educational philosopher. So Patrick and Yusuf and I put together the call, sent it out. And because we were expecting, and when we talked to the publisher, 1 book of possibly, 12 to 14 chapters, possibly. And the response was so great. I think we had 150 chapter authors come in. So all of a sudden we had to rethink. And then those of you who have done writing and editing and book creation had to start doing our mapping exercise to see what possible themes, how many chapters could we put in each volume would make sense, and then what types of themes could be emerging coming out. And I had, at the time, all the authors also got the theoretical framework, which I'll share in a moment, because their topics had to be in somehow way or had to be able to be in some way analyzed or discussed through this notion of transformative leadership. So that's where it came out. And then the themes that came out were these 4 themes around values and ethics. And it's really interesting the way the book series evolved. There was values and ethical change. There was context, because we had people all over the world with very diverse contexts. And on this slide, it talks about these multiple intersecting crises, also multiple intersecting contexts. You've got political, you've got social, cultural, linguistic, geographic, all kinds of different contexts. So context, the third one was diversity, which needs to be included all the time. And the last one came down to something I had been thinking about all the way along. And it's sort of when I started talking with Yusuf about, Julia has picked this up and it's within her chapter, but pulling in, because my background is in Africa and living in the Maasai regions of southern Kenya for 5 years, and understanding a different way of knowing and being that just challenges everything we know as Western educated individuals. So this notion of Ubuntu, and all of a sudden, and Ubuntu and something called egotistical leadership, which pushes the notion and the understanding of the human being as not being on top of this pyramid anymore. We should be somewhere in the middle of it, surrounded by all these others. So it was bringing in these different concepts, and this notion of ethics of care, which is the theme of this last volume, has been critiqued over time because in its original stage came out as more a Western notion of an ethics of care, where when you start to bring in some of these other lenses, and especially in that volume, I really wanted to push things for us to look at the role and responsibility of higher education for ethics of care within an institution for students and faculty, between institutions, because in my work, I do a lot of work, global North, global South partnerships. What's an ethic of care when you're kind of doing that kind of work? And then the third, in both the third volume and the fourth volume, the last sections in each of them are Indigenous-led, Indigenous insights and Indigenous ways of understanding these themes. And if you have a chance to read that last section in the volume that Julia's chapter is in, it's an incredibly forward-thinking, challenging section on an ethics of care, looking at the role and responsibility of higher ed in post-human context. Because we're the largest think tanks around the world. We've got great research potential. We've got great teaching potential. We've got great power on dissemination of different types of knowledge. So that's where the fourth volume, fourth theme came from, Julia.
Well, Mary, I mean, there's so much in what you've shared. I just have a couple of questions or points, and one is, how can people access the books, the series? I think we've got it available now through our library, but maybe
I'll
later
have to share. I'll share the link with Jenny and Tommy.
Yeah,
they can get it into
just
the CTEI.
for folks. Yeah, for folks
probably,
who are interested
Julia,
in really...
probably we can use the links from the Oxford and the Cornell book launches, and students or individuals can also get there was a discount, 35% discount, I think. And I'm sure individuals would be able to use those flyers and those links.
That would be great, Mary, if you wouldn't mind putting that in, because I know when Mary and I presented along with several others at the conference, the higher ed conference at Cornell recently, I was just so taken by the different contributors, including from Yorkville. So we had 11 contributors from Yorkville, I believe. You know, just fascinating work. And of course, this is the kickoff in this series. So in future events, and I think Jenny's going to put in the chat at some point the upcoming sessions where people will really have an opportunity to dive into their individual chapters. But I was just so blown away by just the quality of the thinking and how people were, I mean, these chapters are all theoretically grounded, but as Mary, you said at the beginning, right, really then move to what are the implications for practice. And I just think there's so much wisdom in the chapters across these 4 volumes that we really need to attend to. And I'm so grateful that Tommy's with us here today because I know you're supposed to be on vacation. So not necessarily modeling best practice, but he promised that this was really good work-life balance. But I'm so grateful, Tommy, you're here because I think there's so many issues that are going to be raised, and I'll be really keen, you know, to participate in further thinking, right, about what are the implications for us in terms of what we teach, how we assess that learning. So I do see this book series as a bit of a gift that Mary's provided that's kind of catalyzed some really great contributions, but I don't want it to end there, right? I really want us to look at how we can use this work to focus our thinking and really help Yorkville truly become a leader in this space. But the other thing I wanted to do,
Julia,
just to
I know one
engage
thing we talked about with Jenny, Julia, as well, and Tommy wasn't there when we had a meeting last week, but we're hoping that those of you here and that when Jenny and Tommy send it out, possibly Yorkville might form some kind of a cross-disciplinary, cross-departmental community of practice, or whatever you would like to call it. But bringing, as that opening slide where I said, you have. Your voices are so important. Your experiences are so important. Your different disciplinary understandings are so important to say. And Yorkville already has the core. I know Julia will get into this, but Yorkville already has the core values and the signature learning outcomes. As we go through and talk about some of these concepts, think about, share what you are doing, but think about other possibilities of how this could come to life even more through your practice, through yours and through other faculty members' practice, because it doesn't just benefit the students, it benefits you, it benefits your colleagues, it benefits the institution as a whole. So just keep those in mind as well.
Thanks, Mary. And we are going to be posing some questions as we go through today's workshop. And I'd like to pose one now. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Mary so she can share a few more slides. But we've been talking about all of these sort of pressures for change, and certainly COVID and the pandemic was one. And Mary, you broadly talked about some other potential pressures. I'd just love to ask the question for everyone on the call today. What do you think is the most significant pressure for change impacting higher education in Canada today from your perspective? And if you really feel the need to put in second or third one, you've got your top three. But I just love to get a sense for the folks on the call. Like, what do you think? There is I guess my thesis is there is an absolute clarion cry for transformative change in higher education today. And if you agree with that thesis, what is causing it? What is that cry? Where is that pressure for change coming from? So maybe Mary, as you pivot to the next slide, you can we'll allow people an opportunity to put that in the chat.
Great. I'll just go back. I think it's really important that everybody sort of understands when we talk about transformative leadership, what is it? Because when I teach the education leadership course for Yorkville, but it's not just in that course. I find even with these authors around the world, there's a big confusion, and there's often a conflation of two terms that sound very similar: transformative and transformational. Transformational is an organizational term, more for moving an organization forward, more with an instrumental focus or value, where transformative is really grounded in equity and issues of equity and social justice. I've pushed it, and the authors in this series have pushed it, because I keep nudging them beyond just equity and social justice to eco-justice, to eco-resilience, to socio-ecological leadership or understanding, so that we look at, all of these elements. The circles, the arches don't start in any one particular spot. They're ongoing, because they continue to feed transformative leadership, because the notions are ongoing, and different arrows can start the process. But it basically goes through, it's from a model that we've adapted a little bit from Carolyn Shields' work, but it's basically moved from an inequitable organization with humans, with beyond humans, to what's called a transforming organization. So I'll just start we'll start at the bottom: interdependence, interconnectedness, and global awareness. Most of the issues, it'll be interesting, I can't see the chat, what's going on in there in terms of what the issues are coming up, but almost all the issues, I bet, that are in the chat are not just local. They're local, and many of them will be global as well. So, and many of them are intersecting or interconnected. So it's the notion of both the issues being interconnected and also the people being interconnected. And then, because of this cry, Julia said, what is the cry out there that's kind of pushing this? There is a mandate in this model and in this notion, what I sent out, or what Patrick and Yusuf and I sent out in the handbook series preface. There's a call for equitable change in human and beyond human. So then lots of these new, and this is where when we put the challenge out to you, Julia and I, about the new knowledge frameworks and mindsets, it's about thinking differently. We've all grown up with an understanding of education and how education can be done. But it's about thinking beyond that, bringing in other insights, welcoming other ways of knowing and being that, again, open up the next stage, which democracy, emancipation, and equity. My notion of democracy is a much more substantive notion. The last book that I wrote for Bloomsbury pushes and talks about this notion of a robust global democracy. And I see democracy as something about getting voices out there and getting action happening. So, but you can't just have this new knowledge. You've got to get people working, talking, engaging together. Redistributive power. I see that happening at Yorkville already in terms of the way different groups are being given power and opportunity to share voices and to engage. Moral courage up at the top. Anyone who has ever engaged in any of these challenging issues, and again, I'd be interested to see what's in the chat, but I bet most of those issues will take moral courage. And that's where a leader walks the talk, doesn't just put out the talk. And it's the walking the talk. And this issue, you'll see in the first volume, there's a couple of really good chapters that go into issues of moral courage and examples of issues where that's had to come out. And often, even though you shouldn't be standing on your own at the top of the leadership chain within an organization, often you are. And often you need to be the one. But leadership happens at every level within an organization, and it's needed at every level. This idea of public and private good, it's introduced in the handbook series forward, and all the authors got it. And I see it coming out in a number of the things, Julia, I can't remember what I've written, but I saw it come out in some of the Yorkville material about, and I think linked into the signature learning outcomes. I don't know if you can talk to this at all, but I know I have seen that notion come out as well in some of the Yorkville work. And then the last one is the critique and promise, that's what I'm saying. It's the hope and possibilities that's what global higher education should be all about, both critiquing issues and practices that are going on, but also giving that hope, giving that promise to your students, to your communities, to the world, that we are working on coming up with change, with transforming from all of the pressures. I'm interested to see what's in there. I have lots of the crises and change levers that have been discussed in the handbook series. So let me leave it there.
Thank you, Mary. So is this where I flip to my slides?
Well, I haven't. Do you want me to do the key lessons, or I think let's take a break from me talking, Julia. Julia's chapter, because it fits in really well. I've already introduced the ethics of care. Julia's chapter fits in really well and is a really good, when we talk about you need to be putting theory and praxis together, it's a really good example of where it can be done and how it can be done. Let me stop sharing.
Okay, thanks, Mary. And then I'll pull mine up here. All right, let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay, so thank you, Mary, for that intro, and we'll circle back at the end and give you time if there was a few other slides that you're really keen to come back to. So I was very interested to see what you all wrote in the chat, and I think it just shows, right, that we all look at the world through our own lenses in terms of what were the pressures or catalysts for change that you were most aware of. And I have to say that as president, I spend a lot of time thinking about pressures for change and actually feeling them acutely. So maybe it's no surprise that at the top of my list was budgetary and political pressures for change. But what a crazy time we live in when you can have a university like Queen's that is running, you know, $20–30 million deficits and proudly sharing that the deficit they're anticipating for next year is only 20 million. And this is after all of these other cost-cutting measures. And of course, a lot of the budgetary pressures that public universities and colleges are facing right now in Canada is because of the significant changes the government is making in terms of eligibility for student visas, right, coming to Canada. And I think international students were really shoring up a lot of our institutions. We're very fortunate at Yorkville that we are budget positive. We're not running a deficit. We're in fact generating revenue that we're able to reinvest, and that supports our ongoing commitment to all class sizes. So really are very unique within the Canadian higher education landscape. So I just wanted to share these bullets here are what I'm seeing sort of across Canada. And as I talk to leaders at other public institutions, I know a lot of faculty are feeling a ton of pressure with the increasing expectations again at the publics now, but significantly increasing classes. There, it's like, you know, 200 to 400 students in class, while faculty are being expected to do more of different kinds of work than they've ever been called on to do before, and including in terms of mental health support, dealing with increased diversity in their classrooms, working on projects, decolonizing the curriculum, ensuring that their classes are embracing a positive culture and environment, recognizing increased understandings of diversity. So, you know, there's a lot that faculty are dealing with, as well as, you know, how do I assess with confidence in an AI-infused world? And I was speaking to an alumnus of an MACP program who is a full-time faculty member elsewhere. And she just said, Julia, like, I just feel like giving up. She said, I try to be so thoughtful in the assessments that I provide my students, but my smallest class is 200, and I no longer know, you know, what is AI, what has been produced AI, what is the student's original work. But she said, my working assumption is the majority of the work I'm looking at has been AI generated. And she said, I don't know if I can keep doing this anymore. So I think there's a bit of call it some angst, right, within, as people are feeling increased pressures and wondering what does it all mean. And then at the same time, we have employers being increasingly critical of the graduates, right, and saying they don't have the skills or aptitudes that we're looking for. And you know, add on the post-truth era. Luckily in Canada, universities and colleges still do enjoy largely the confidence of the public, but in the US, that's a very different scenario. And I don't know how many of you follow the polls that look at, you know, sort of public opinion of higher education. But certainly in Canada, it is still strong and positive. It's declining, but the public in Canada has more confidence in higher education than any other public sector or organization. But employers are interesting, right? In this changing context, they want students who have skills, right? Very, very specific skills. They want students to be able to do, not just to know, right? A university degree is to be a representation of what you know, but employers are saying, which is great, but if you actually can't do anything with it, that you know, sort of the value of that knowledge is limited. So it's been interesting to see how universities have responded to this clarion cry from employers that please graduate people who can kind of hit the ground running. And as soon as you understand then this need for this kind of a shift, if we're facilitating the development of skills as opposed to transferring knowledge to be repeated on a paper, well, what does that mean, right, in terms of our pedagogy and in terms of our assessment? The other big pressure for change is coming from the United Nations, the commitment of countries that are members of the UN, to the UN's 2030 agenda. And Mary, that loops back to what you were saying about sustainability, right? And eco-leadership. So I did want to share this slide on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Many of you have heard me talk about the SDGs before, but just to say, this is essentially the United Nations and member states, how they've communicated, and this was launched in 2015. And so the 2030 agenda, saying these are the things that we all need to collectively be working towards. So no poverty, for example. You'll see in there quality education, number 4, and I think that's really interesting. And each one of these squares, you can go on, just Google the UN SDGs. These are all interactive, and you can see some of the sub-goals. And under quality education, you can see on the screen, there is one, global citizenship education. So Mary, that's getting back to what you're saying, right, about that global awareness and understanding different cultures and interactions, right, between countries. And education for sustainable development, the UN calling for these to be mainstreamed, embedded in national education policies and curriculum, teacher education, and student assessment. UNESCO, of course, associated with the United Nations. I've been so interested to follow their work. I think they've had some of the clearest cries for change. And they're saying what we need is an action-oriented, transformative pedagogy which supports self-directed learning, participation, collaboration. Oh, that should say problem orientation. So they want students, again, to be actively engaged, to be exposed to knowledge, but looking at how do they bring that together in an interdisciplinary way, focused on creating positive change in the world. So highly participatory, collaborative, self-directed, right? Teaching students the skills, facilitating the skills so they can engage in self-directed learning. And so it's cry for a transformative pedagogy, right? We've known forever that the lecture is very limited in terms of the benefits that it derives. So a real call for a fundamental rethink, again, of what we teach, how we teach, and how we assess student learning. And sorry, there's a phone ringing in the background that I can't run away and turn off. I'm sorry, I should have put the volume down. It will go away in a second. So when Mary invited me to participate with this chapter, I thought, okay, this is a great opportunity for me to jump into 2 concepts that I'd already been playing with in my head and thinking about. I wonder how we might think about these concepts at Yorkville. And the one is Ubuntu, and Ashley laughs at me because he says I never do it with the right South African accent. Mary, I think you said it really well. But I first became exposed to this concept then that's not going to work. Tommy, maybe you can help me put a link to the Taking Stock 2.0 book. And Tommy, I gave him, or I think he collected at the STLHE conference, a few volumes of this book. But there's a really brilliant chapter in here. And Joy Mighty, who was a former president of STLH, she actually followed me in that role. She contributed to this with her colleague Bahari Leek. And I just thought it was a brilliant synopsis of the concept of Ubuntu and the implications. And so talking about a relational ontology that foregrounds the collective, a humanist philosophy, a social practice marked by sincere warmth with which people treat both strangers and members of the community, a value and disposition which brings a focus on dignity and social relationships. And I loved all of those words, all of those descriptors. And I just thought, wow, what would it look like if higher education really embraced that concept of Ubuntu? And really the idea is that to what extent are we helping students develop the interest and the skills to engage effectively with others, right? To contemplate the big questions that can really have impact on the world. And so again here, and so really now I'm borrowing from Joy, because she's made so many keynote presentations on this, right? About saying we need to be far more attentive to the choices we make about what we teach, how we teach, and the learning environments that we create. What would it mean to create classroom environments that represent Ubuntu Kur, or humanizing pedagogies, right? Where people feel inspired and included, and again, are working towards developing skills that are going to enable them to have a positive impact on society. The second concept I had an opportunity to play with is an ethic of care. And for those of you who were on the last Tuesdays with Julia, because we had a great question, or it was to say, what's your favorite book? And I love this one. Yeah, it's just so fabulous. Whoops, I'm trying to move everyone's faces so I can get the title, but I'm moving the book instead. There we go. Relationship Rich Education. How Human Connections Drive Success. And this is by Peter Felton and Leo Lambert. And I had the pleasure of meeting these gentlemen when Allison and I were at an AACU conference last January. And also in the audience was David Hornsby. And David was the one who coined the phrase relentless welcome. And so you will see these concepts of an ethic of care that have been embedded in Yorkville's distinctive capabilities, and where we've wondered, like, what would it mean if we really took the advice from this book, created that sense of relentless welcome, and not just for our students, but for each other, right? It is my hope that stepping on to a Yorkville or a TFS campus into a classroom, whether you're a faculty member, a staff member, a student, that you might experience genuine welcome and deep care, and for all of us to be inspired to learn and to continue to learn, developing significant relationships and exploring questions of meaning and purpose. And in fact, that's exactly what we're doing in this workshop today, right? Collectively trying to explore questions of meaning and purpose, and what are the implications for all of us in each of our roles? And I agree with Mary, there's leadership in every corner, right, of any organization. There's a concept in business called sphere of influence. And typically our sphere of influence is much greater than we realize. And so how can each one of us within our own spheres of influence behave and engage with others in what represent these concepts? And I just got 2 more slides, and then we're going to turn it to all of you. So I was so thrilled when Yorkville developed these signature learning outcomes. And you'll see that in here, many of the concepts that Mary and I have been talking about. We want all of our graduates, regardless if it's in TFS acting or Master's of Counseling Psychology, BBA project management, Bachelor of Interior Design. What does that mean? Social responsibility, right? And what is the role that people can play in helping create a more just society? We want people who know how to and have the skills to be collaborative, persuasive, creative, professionally engaged, digitally capable. That's a really big one for me. And I'm absolutely thrilled with the investment we recently made in new technology for Toronto Film School to make sure those students have really the best technology. Because again, back to employers, with those students graduating confident in their ability to use, right, to apply, to create through current technology, right, is such a game changer for those grads and the job environment they'll be graduating into. But the same goes for every single one of our students. I want to make sure that our accounting grads are exposed to the appropriate software, right? That Master's of Counseling Psychology students, a lot of counseling is being AI enabled. Allison and I had a great conversation with the folks at Kids Helpline recently. Fascinating to see how they're using technology as they provide 24/7 multiple language support to young folks across Canada. So I want all of our grads to be ready again, to hit the ground running, and to be self-aware, right? Self-awareness, I'm going to come to the top of this now, sort of precedes all of this, right? And Mary, I was so happy you were willing to share sort of the beginnings of your journey, and you know, what inspires you, what do you bring? Like, who are you as you come to work each day? What do you bring with you? What inspires you? And so I think when we're clear on that, right, then we're just so much better able to lead lives of meaning and purpose. And that's my hope for all of our students. And so having this commitment, right, to be working towards these signature learning outcomes. But again, there's espoused and enacted, right? All kinds of universities espouse all kinds of things, but we have to become very disciplined and creative about how we get there. And so that's why for me, I'm really happy that we're moving forward with a very thorough curricular mapping, right? And assessment and gap analysis. How are we doing with respect to these signature learning outcomes, and what needs to change to help us really get there? And what is the role for each one of us in that? So I do think, again, when you accept that at the end of the day, as well as the disciplinary knowledge, these are transferable skills that we want all of our students to have the opportunity to develop competence in. You cannot lecture skills, right? You have to facilitate their development, and feedback has to be meaningful. And we're going to have to look at what are the barriers to achieving that authentically. Again, so it's not just espoused, but it's fully enacted through all of our programs. And of course, supporting all of that, underpinning all of that, are our values. And I love these values. And again, hats off to everyone who was involved giving input, whether at the first point, the kickoff point with the survey about the values that you hold most dear. But I love that where we landed. And I love that the first pillar is the fuel, the learning potential, the student experience being center of what we do, and helping students build confidence, enhancing their strengths and talents, inspiring their achievement. And of course, all the others being equally important, our commitment to ethical conduct and building inclusive communities, and always seeking to learn, right? And as a true learning organization, having the courage, right, to say when we've got it wrong, and to self-correct and ask, what can we learn from this? My biggest hope for Yorkville, really, I think, is that learning organization, because that's what's going to help us truly achieve the others. So this was a great opportunity for me in this book series, Mary, to reflect on Ubuntu and an ethic of care, to sort of proudly share some of the steps that Yorkville's been taking to help achieve this, but recognizing that we've still got a lot of work to do. So at this point, Mary really wanted to open it up to questions, to thoughts. But what I'd like you to, just to kick it off, the chat, is just to say if there's one thing that you think Yorkville should change to help you become better aligned with the achievement of these concepts, what would it be? So one thing, what's your biggest hope that Yorkville will change to make further progress? It is my biggest hope that Yorkville will truly become the Canadian university that gets this right.
Julia, while they're adding things into the chat, I've just looked through the chat. I could respond to a couple of the notions that are in the chat, and then you respond to this next set of chats that are coming in.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Mary.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Couple of things. I was looking through the chat. Let me get that X out of there. And I've sort of divided it into 4 areas just to speak a little bit about. And the first one is the whole area of technology, because technology is one of the factors of change that's across all institutions. The worry and the fears of AI is definitely there all over, but we have to be careful to also keep the openness for potential. And again, with any technologies that have happened through our lifetime, through my lifetime longer than many of your lifetimes, there were always fears of technology. So it's how technology is used that is critically important. And there are some really great chapters in volume 2 and in volume 4 on technology and transformative leadership. And the one that I think of in particularly was the work in volume 4 in the last section, Ubali Joro and her colleagues at Future Earth. There's some really interesting thoughts on positive uses of technology, especially in institutions of higher education where we've got access to all kinds of technology that could be used, again, if you go back to the purpose of education. And that goes right back to the first volume and the mission and vision of your institution. So there's that one to keep in mind. The second one was around teaching. And again, when I saw a comment about structure and flexibility. Someone who went to OISE, I saw something about structure and flexibility. Really important again to remember, transformative leadership is not Julia at the top of your institution. Transformative leadership is every single one of you in whatever role you hold. And those of you who are in teaching positions, that's where it's structure and flexibility in your classes, given whatever opportunities you do have. And this is where it's important to recognize the professionalism and the background and the skills that your faculty have, to really be student-centered. Listen to your students. I see student experience up there really high throughout the material I read about Yorkville. Student experience, but bringing in the transformative leadership lens, and I saw this in the chat somewhere, about being critically reflective and having your students being critically reflective. That can go across all subject areas and all discipline. And in terms of transformative leadership, it is their futures. So having them engaged in the critique and possibilities for their futures, that helps and speaks to both transformative leadership, but the student experience. The third one was just around diversity. I just thought of a number of different areas. Diversity, both, I saw the notions or the comments about accommodation. So there's for your students who have learning exceptionalities, there's for your international students, any of the diversity that comes in. And that's the difference between assimilating into an institution and showing that moral courage to really walk the talk of openness. Within Ubuntu, you have two concepts. You have something called mutuality and pluriversality. Pluriversality is very different from diversity. Diversity looks at the differences between all of us. Pluriversality looks at and recognizes the difference, but how we can all bring those differences together to live together, to help each other out, to build. And that goes to your openness at whatever level of leadership you are, for the learning, the unlearning, and the relearning. And that can happen regardless of the level of leadership in the classroom to the highest level of leadership. And the last one was just around relationality. I saw Hart mention something. Julia mentioned something in terms of the ontology and relationality. Again, there's a number of chapters. Sandra Donater's in the first volume also does some great work on the SDGs and international programs with their institution. But the two that I was thinking of, Ubali Joro's, The Future Earth, Elizabeth Lang's, who talks about a transition imaginary, so kind of rethinking the way we move forward. But then the most important one I thought was, I think it's the last chapter in the last volume by Lewis Williams and her colleagues, again, an Indigenous background, but she talks about something called a generationally and culturally inclusive Indigenous social ecological resilience framework. So learning from across the generations, as in Indigenous ways of knowing the 7 generations before, what we can learn, and our responsibility to the 7 generations that are to come, but different ways, opening yourself to different ways of both thinking, learning, and being. So those are my comments, and I'll let Julia respond. I haven't had a chance to look at what's coming up for Yorkville in the chat.
Yeah, so thanks, Mary. And just to say, like, and I get it that all of that can feel so overwhelming, right? It's like it's all of these pressures for change coming from every direction. The pressure for change that many of you mentioned that I loved was the changing needs of the student, right? And this is where Yorkville really shines in terms of our flexible asynchronous approach that's allowing students to pursue a graduate education in particular, but also some of our other programs in business, online, asynchronous, right? That really breaks through many of the barriers of traditional higher ed. But I want to get back to my question, and I also want to say, please, if you're comfortable, let's see your happy faces and unmute yourselves, because I would love to have more of a conversation now. And again, just so like, how do you think we are doing at Yorkville? And my question was, if there's one thing that we could change that you think would be a really great way of helping us move forward in this direction, I'd love to hear it. Andrew, you bravely followed my direction. Thank you.
Yeah, I put a little thing in the chat as well. So I want to thank you both for this. And Julia, thanks for this opportunity. I just go back to this idea of in this, age of AI, we'll call it. And I really appreciate it. Mary said it shouldn't just be a critical thing, but something that we could see as constructive and positive. So just looking at how we might update assessment styles. So, I mean, I'll just use this simplistic traditional idea of, asking students to write an essay on a particular topic. But all the issues that come into that now with ChatGPT and these things, such as been mentioned a few times. So my suggestion or my comment would be just looking at how we do assess our students going into the future, because a lot of this AI certainly isn't going away.
Thanks, and it's of course, Andrew. It's not just AI, right? It's
Yeah.
when we know that one of the things, the really important things we're trying to teach is transferable skills, is represented by
Yeah.
our signature learning outcomes. How do we assess that?
For sure.
Right? How do we assess professional competence, for example? So, I mean, in some areas it's obvious when we have students out on practicum placement and we're receiving direct feedback on their professional competence. Hart, you've been engaged. So just to say, how do you assess the professional competence of the folks at Toronto Film School? So again, and I know you've been doing some great work teaching students professional competence. And we heard an interesting thing from Trish the other day, saying that when students engaged with that kind of instruction, their retention went way up, right? Where there's a real sort of attention being placed on preparing people for the industry in which they're going to land. It looks like you want to jump in and say something. Thanks.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I always say this to the students that are, signing up for our program, is that it's the start of their career right now when they come to a school like Toronto Film School. And even I always speak to this because my job with TFS is directly related to a prof of mine at U of T. Now I could say over 25 years ago, which is hard to believe, but it's actually directly connected to that. And I think that that's sort of an example of how you're building your network right now, and that ability to be able to even just communicate with a teacher or a faculty member when you're 18 to 25 years old there's a barrier for some students to be able to even communicate professionally with people. So that's a big focus for us. And I see education moving in the same direction as what we see, what AI is going to do to movies and music, which is personalize everything. Everything is becoming more personalized today more than ever. It's what's tailored for you. You've seen this huge change in the IEP system. So I don't know, this is something I think is going to evolve more and more as we, work with AI, right?
Tommy, just a heads up that towards the end of our chat, I'm going to ask you to share what you've heard, because bringing some of these ideas forward, I think your center might have a good role to play in some follow-up workshops or supports. Thanks for that, Hart. Absolutely. Now, Elisa, I just saw you wrote something in the chat here. I'm just wondering if you wanted to turn on your camera and share. I feel like I'm that nasty prof calling on students in class now. Elisa,
Sure,
thank
I
you.
don't mind sharing. I'd love, one of the ways that I have felt very successful in both the teaching opportunities that I've had and also the working opportunities that I've had is this idea to encourage trust and relationships, that we come from a place of like, I trust you. I'm going to trust you, rather than coming from a place of like distrust or, well, they're all going to cheat anyways. Like coming from a place of trusting seems to sometimes shift the ground upon which we are. And yeah, I think that if we can hold that thought in our minds and our hearts, there's actually lots of ways it changes things. And we can have it in terms of AI and technology, and we can have it in terms of in meetings, and we can have it in ways of like how we build our assessments or how we build our ways of communicating with students. And like, I feel like it just can be pervasive. Okay, that's all I'm going to say now. I'm really shy.
Okay, well, Elisa, thank you so much for sharing that. It's a really an interesting point. And, you know, organizational culture is so complicated, right? And we can declare things, and we've declared our values, but what do we need to do to really make sure we're each living them every day, right? And so how do we encourage them? How do we nurture them? What do we do when we feel they've been violated? But I absolutely agree with you. When you're working in an environment where you can trust one another, it's an entirely different place than when you feel you can't. So yeah, I think it's a pretty profound statement making, and then facilitate in the classroom. And you know, what does that look like? Thank you. Okay, if I'm not gonna call anyone now. I'm gonna take Allison's advice. And how many seconds are we supposed to wait? Allison, is it 7? And do the count and see who wants to jump in and unmute themselves and join in. And again, this is your chance to say, Julia, this is what we really need to do. And I'll say, okay, Tommy, can you make that happen, please? But what if there's something that you think that Yorkville needs to embrace to help us all make progress here? It's very hard to wait 7 seconds. You're all just being miserable to me. Okay, Tristan.
Oh, I was typing like a madman to try and beat the clock. And I think just one of the things that would be helpful for me as a very novice instructor is additional resources and materials to help me know how to teach students how to use the tools available, because they're going to use them. They're going to. And if we show them how, then we're answering the signature learning outcome of being digitally capable and also being aware, self-aware of how to use them, when to use them, how not to use them, etc. There's a real opportunity for that, probably in most programs. But as I teach University 101, you know, this is one of the foundational skills that they need to learn.
Well, it's a really interesting point. And when we were at the STLHE conference in Niagara Falls, I attended most of the workshops I could fit in on AI because I was interested to see how other universities, the educational developers, were facilitating learning around AI. And in the one session, we were given a task, right? We had to learn about something and ask AI about it. And it was, I think there was 3 different AI platforms. And it was so fascinating to compare how different the responses were on the thing. And it was a very powerful way of illustrating the limits of AI. And then, you know, it's all about how you prompt, right? How you question, and then an opportunity to change how we questioned and then change it again. And I just thought, wow, every class needs to do that. The faculty member and the students together, understanding that as it relates to that particular topic. But the crazy thing is in most cases, the students are way out ahead of the faculty on this one. And I think it's going to require the faculty to embrace the concepts we've been talking about, like to show their own vulnerability, to show their own uncertainty, to share their own concerns. And I bet their students would teach them a lot about it. Right? So this is this brave new world that we're in now, right? And it is going to change. It's going to, I believe it will fundamentally change the dynamic between faculty member and student. Mary, you look like you want to jump in.
I was typing it, but instead of typing, I'll just put it in. I had one of my graduate students a number of years ago when we were doing a lot of virtual learning, come up with this term, power to the proletariat. Like, give them some power. They have so much knowledge and they have so many skills. And it's about saying it's always scary to give up some power in terms of the control and new ideas for technology coming in. But again, talk with your students, whoever, Tristan just said that, or Allison just said that. Talk with your students. It's their generation. They know an awful lot more than many of us do. Work together. Again, that's a relationship, building that relationship, working together, trusting each other. They also want to be able to move forward and do these things. And you do need to be cautious. You do have to have those relationships. But again, it's scary. That's the moral courage. It's scary to hand over a bit of power.
Irene, I'm seeing you bravely on with your camera, but being so quiet. And I know you do a lot of work on international students in particular. Did you have anything you wanted to add to the conversation?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you. I would say to echo Andrew, one of my main concerns teaching international students is that I think there is something there with the assignments that is not working well. And this is now part of my an intervention that I hope that I will be able to apply in the next term or next year. There is something there. So we assume that we know the logic order that students should follow in order to complete an assignment. And I think that this is a mistake. So in the intervention that I am proposing, I will ask the students to tell us what is the order, not the logic, the order that is logic to me, the order that is logic to international students. And I think that this will help us find out what are the contradictions there, because there are a lot of contradictions. And the students told me, Irene, this is the first time that someone is asking me for an assignment. In my previous academic culture, I only took exams and tests. And now they are asking me for assignments and I need to use sources. What is that? So this is probably something there that we need to map the assignments. And also in some of my psychology courses, when I ask for reaction papers, they share with me, nobody told me how to do that. So now you are asking me to do that. And interesting. So probably we need to think about the assignments, the structure of the assignments, and not only for international students, for all students.
So Irene, that's fascinating. I used to work with a woman named Nancy Schmidt at Guelph, and her doctoral dissertation was on the currency of grades. And her point was essentially, we can say all we want to about the purpose of a course, and we can have all kinds of incredible materials and give students access to it. but at the end of the day, they attend to the grade, right? And I mean, we can debate intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, but at the end of the day, it's the assessment drives behavior, right? And so I think it's very interesting, and I'm so happy to hear that you're asking these critical questions about that, and I think we could all benefit. Okay, I'm sensing the energy in the room, and I'm thinking we should probably move to close. But I wanted to give Mary and Jenny and Tommy just an opportunity to share an ending comment or observation on the discussion. But I want to thank you all so very much for being here today. And I hope you will attend some of the other workshops, because I think they're going to be really great. And again, opportunity to profile the research YU faculty have been doing on this theme. And coming out of the whole series, I'm looking forward to seeing what Tommy and think should be the priorities for us to champion moving forward. Oh, Tim's on. Thank you, Tim. You've been quietly in the background somewhere. I didn't see you, or I might have called on you, but I'll read your chat comment. Well, maybe I'll turn it over to Mary first.
Let me just unmute there, Julia. I just want to again thank you, Julia, for sending the nudge off to CTEI to set up the speaker series. And a thank you, I see Nishreen is here. A real thank you to the Yorkville faculty who were contributing authors to the at least one of the 4 volumes, for getting involved and sharing your information and sharing your experiences. I will post the link. I'll send the link to Jenny and Tommy to send out. And I would encourage you to consider, I know you're all involved in many, many different things. At least consider, and Jenny and Tommy can talk about how it might be done, something like a community of practice, or something as a way of sharing how you're actually making some of these concepts come to life, because it's the sharing, the collaboration. That's the one thing I found in the Faculty of or the Masters of Education program. We've had some incredibly rich collaborative groups, and it's the sharing. It's again, the relationships and the trust isn't just between you and the students. It's between you as faculty to become learning partners together, and to not be afraid to be sharing and bouncing ideas and critiquing and questioning, because that's all of that benefits all of you, and it benefits the students, and it benefits the institution.
Thanks, Mary.
Those
Jenny,
are my closing, Julia.
Thanks so much, Jenny.
So much of what was said today resonated with me, and as someone who researches actually the ways educators develop their assessment practice and the impact of assessment discourses on our identities as learners and educators, those comments excited me especially. So I'm just going to shamelessly plug, if anyone wants to talk about those things some more, or to talk about assessment design like in practice, or just your philosophy around assessment, please send me an email. That would be awesome. I do have some things to share around the next sessions, but I'll just check to see if Tommy has anything he wants to share before I do like our closing.
Thank you, Jenny.
And I do. I've been sitting here listening to this conversation, seeing our faculty at YU and TFS on this call, and I'm so honored to be building this teaching center here with all of you and for all of you. And this conversation's anticipating so much of the stuff that's coming up, because yesterday was the 4-month mark of the senior education developer team being hired at Yorkville and Toronto Film School, and things are coming. We're about like the things I'm hearing from you folks around this craving for more connections with each other as our professoriate across these institutions, craving connections in, more resources and pieces. We're going to be launching in September new initiatives around what I think we're going to be calling CTI Connections. And I'm already seeing in the chat, Elisa and Tristan are connecting and having a conversation, but you'll be able to, and you can start now. Jenny, if you want to post the CTI email address in the chat, you can email us, and we are so looking forward to connecting one-on-one or in small groups in a consultative kind of manner with you folks around your teaching. We are going to be launching what we're calling our CTI communities, so communities of practice, of care, following this ethic of care model as well, and communities of play to find and build more of these ways for us to work together. And then coming in 2025, which I'm going to need to be starting soon. So I'm going to say it out loud here so the accountability is on me. The annual teaching conference for us across Yorkville and well. So these really great ways to keep this craving that I'm hearing for more and more connections with each other in teaching and learning absolutely are coming with and through the center. So I'm so proud and I'm so excited to be here and working with all of you.
Thank you, Tommy. Really, really well said. And I'd be so excited to see all of that come to fruition. So thank you. Okay, Jenny, I think you were going to do as you said, the final.
I'll keep it short. I just wanted to thank Mary and Julia one more time for their time, insights, and leadership. And a thank you to everyone who came today for engaging. As the series continues over the rest of the year, we encourage everyone to think about the ways you might bring some of what you're hearing into your work, into your teaching, and to reach out to us if you're looking for a conversation partner or a co-conspirator. To register for the upcoming August and September speaker series sessions, please check your inboxes for a newsletter that went out earlier this week, or I'm also going to paste the links in the chat, but they might be formatted a bit weirdly because I can't. Now it's telling me my message is too long. Here, let me do them one by one. So I'll put that in the chat, and we're really excited to see everyone at these other sessions.
Right. And thank you, Jenny. Thanks, Tommy. Thank you all for being here. I just really appreciate you being here, and hope you have a weekend.